me get out my crystal. I've never been more nervous during an introduction when I heard that. As we all know, there are many people who grace the world of marine mammal studies that we say, oh, please don't think I'm one of those folks. But anyway, thank you for that introduction. It turned out very nice. Thank you. I will breathe regularly now. I have an unusual situation professionally. As Renato said, I have a chair in business ethics at Loyola Marymount University. I'm director of the Center for Ethics and Business there. Actually, it gets stranger. This is my second career as an academic. For the first 20 years, I specialized in 16th century Renaissance humanism. You know, the most natural thing to do before you, particularly when you're going to do work on marine mammals. So, I like to think I do interesting things. I think some of my colleagues think that I have a personality disorder. They may be right, but anyway. I came to work on philosophical issues related to marine mammal science almost accidentally. But what I want to talk about tonight is less about the substance of the work that I've done, the substance of the argument in defense of dolphins and the work I've continued to do. But I want to reflect on more the process and some of the challenges that come from doing interdisciplinary work and some of the challenges that go with scientific progress and the discoveries that have been made over the last 30 to 50 years about cetaceans. And so what I want to do is to kind of talk about that and then reflect on some of the challenges about how we may address, all of us, since we're all in the same boat in this way, want to address these things as we go along. I'll talk about 20, 25 minutes, so you can start your clocks. I tend to run on time. So that's the way it'll go. And then we can discuss if you want. I've been in academics for 40 years. I got an early start. And the entire time I have been in academics, I have heard interdisciplinary work, multidisciplinary work is a good thing. We have to get out of the boxes of our disciplines. And I've never heard anyone disagree with that. It's kind of intuitively obvious that if we can bring different intellectual disciplinary perspectives to a problem, things will work better. The problem, though, is that that's easier. It's not that it's easier said than done. It's that it turned out to be remarkably easy for me to do this. But the problem is that getting the results of that kind of inquiry back into the mainstream, I have found to be really pretty daunting. So what I want to do, first of all, is talk about the process of how I got into this. John Hildebrand earlier asked me casually, how'd you get into this? And I said, well, I'll talk about that tonight. And so, thank you, John, for waiting. This is the answer. So I want to talk about how I got into this, what the process was, and then what I see as some of the challenges about all of this. Now, I want to say at the outset, for anyone who is a student, anyone who is junior faculty, in essence, this is the don't do this at home warning. And I'm serious about this. And this kind of non-traditional research is a risky business to be in. I mean, I've had significant problems in my career, not problems, but issues in my career because of that. And one of the things at some point I want us all to talk about is the fact that there are some ways in which this kind of work, which we always say is a good thing to do, if you do it too early in your career, it really is a matter of professional suicide. So, how did I end up being here, a philosopher talking to you all? Well, as I mentioned to John, it was virtually by accident. I had done at the time, I was teaching at a small liberal arts college in New Jersey, Uppsala College, which sadly no longer exists. And I was teaching in the philosophy and religion department, and I was teaching regular philosophy courses. I had written a short ethics textbook for my students because I wasn't happy with what was available. and the print is all published. And they then contacted me because I have a fairly casual, readable style. And they said, we'd like you to do, would you be willing to do an introductory textbook for us? But what we'd like is that you end up talking about the philosophical issues by going through some non-philosophical disciplines. So I said, sure. What did I know? I was young and stupid. So at the time, to do that wasn't, for most of it, wasn't a big problem. I knew enough about psychology to be able to talk about sort of psychological issues to then get to sort of free will and determinism. I knew enough about theoretical physics to get to some issues about the nature of reality and all of that. But I really needed a chapter or two on science. Now, there is some supreme irony that I end up talking to scientists because I was this much of a science guy in college. We had a one-year general biology requirement. And I took, a one-year science requirement. I took the general bio course because it was the only course that did not have a lab. So that was my scientific background. Now, I admired scientists. I thought they did wonderful work, but I wasn't one of those folk. So I had this problem. How do I now figure out how to get something from biology, particularly, into the book? I also had another problem at the same time, which was that I had to deal with, in the book, a topic that, in contemporary metaphysics, it's the notion of personhood. What is it to be a being when you have a certain sort and when you remove all definitions regarding species? Now, in the world of contemporary metaphysics, I will tell you quite plainly, the discussions about personhood are as dull as toast. And actually, that's not entirely accurate. Just put it that way, is an insult to toast. And I needed to find a way to talk about something like that in a way that the people reading the book, my students wouldn't be asleep after a page and a half. So, I'm trying to figure this out. A couple of things happened. I grew up in Massachusetts by the water, and you always hear interesting stories about dolphins when you're by the water. And a friend of mine came back from Florida who had been on one of these dolphin swim programs. And I thought, okay, this could work. I can, sort of ask the fictional question, are dolphins persons? And I'll get this, I'll do this 2-chapter set, one, this analysis of concept personhood, and then I'll spend some time reading about the science. I'll go down, in a dolphin swim program, and that'll be it. So I thought, okay, problem solved. This is kind of a one-time thing. Well, I went down to the Dolphin Research Center, where I started talking to trainers. Met a woman who's now Laura Engleby, whom some of you know, who was with NOAA in Florida. And Laura was just a tremendous resource because of that. This was now 1988 when I got into all of this. And that summer, I was going to be at Berkeley for a postdoctoral seminar on Socrates. And Laura said, oh, you have to meet Ken Norris, Diana Reese, Bernd Wurtzig. They're all terrific people. And so she gave me their names and addresses and sent them. So I go off to California. And I meet with all of those folks. And I've got to tell you, initially I had great apprehension about whether any credible scientist would be willing to talk to me on all of this. And I've got to tell you, anyone who Ken Norris, just, a god among men, couldn't have been more generous, couldn't have been more helpful. Diana, Bernd, everybody that I talked to just was super. Now, as I said, I figured this was kind of a one-time chapter. I get to California, this is the late 80s, the dolphin tuna controversy, we know nothing about on the East Coast. So I get out here, I hear about that as well. And so as I'm finishing up this, some prolific chapter that I was doing for the book, which really had no answer to it. I kind of look at the research and don't come to any particular conclusions. And, but now that I'm about to go in a year or so, I end up in business school, I thought, okay, I can, since I need to shift my research from the 16th century, I'll write about some of the ethical issues connected with the dolphin tuna problem. And so at that point, I started going to the ACS meeting, the Marine Mammal Conference, and at one of those I met Denise Herzing. And I'm, these days, I'm a member of her advisory board on the Wild Dolphin Project. And again, Laura said, you got to meet this woman who's doing this study on wild dolphins in the Bahamas. So I talked to Denise, another incredibly generous person, who said, you got to come out to see this. So and I'm thinking this is the most natural thing in the world for a philosopher to do. To read all the scientific literature I'm told to read and then to go along on field work. It turns out, philosophers don't do this sort of thing. So I go out in 1990 with Denise, I'm hooked. And up until a few years ago, every field season I'd be out observing her work. I assume if you don't know about the Wild Dolphin Project, for decades now, Denise has been doing studies of a couple of communities of wild spotted dolphins. Just, amazing work. And so I like to think I have the distinction of being the only philosopher on the planet doing this kind of work who's actually spent any significant time observing field work. Now, I do know that my role on the boat was something between ballast and shark bait, but nonetheless, I was really honored to be there. So, this goes really well. I do all this research for a number of years. It took me about 15 years before I felt comfortable to write the book, because I'm coming from a place of knowing nothing, and especially once you get into the world of wild dolphins, things become dramatically more complicated and dramatically more interesting. So, finished the book, probably in about 2004, I guess it was. And then, now I should say in the meantime, I'm doing papers on these topics at some philosophy conferences. And after I do this 3 or 4 times, I decide, this is pointless. Nobody is really interested in the multidisciplinary dimension of all of this. And the questions that they ask show so little understanding of the scientific literature, I'm bored. So I actually kind of disappeared from my own field for a few years, because the mechanism that we typically use for helping you engage in problems wasn't working. And I'm not a scientist, so it didn't really make any point for me to talk to scientific symposia, although I had good conversations with people like Ken and Denise and scientists who were interested in all of this. When I get to try to publish the book, I have, of course, now a folder of rejections that say, it's not really a philosophy book. It's not really a science book. It takes me a couple of years before I finally get a contract with Blackwell, who they put it in a series in philosophy and public policy. But the manuscript was originally like 140,000 words, and they say, well, that's really nice, except we don't want anything more than 80,000. So I cut a lot out of that book. And I'm thinking, okay, this is now the point where I'll be able to get people engaging in the issues, because what the book does is survey. For most of the book is actually a survey of the scientific research that's been done on the intellectual and emotional abilities of dolphins, really in the last 50 years. So what's that? Brain structure, the standard research, and everybody, Lauren Marino, Adam Pack from Lou Berman's lab, everyone that I talked to was incredibly generous about letting me, talk about their research. And so I'm figuring what I'm trying to do is just lay out the scientific research that explains what kind of beings dolphins seem to be when you look at this data from the point of view of a philosopher. And so the answer to me then came to me, now that I was more deeply into everything, it looked to me like dolphins were non-human persons. That is, they were beings who had the kind of, in particular, individuality that we seem to have. And then the second question, what does that say? What are the ethical implications of that? Well, when you then look at issues related to human-dolphin interaction, it then meant that there were a number of issues that needed deeper exploration about, in the fishing industry, deaths and injuries of dolphins, captivity, captive breeding, and the like in the entertainment business. But, at the very least, there were some issues that the science had now brought to the surface that hadn't been there before. Legitimate issues that all the scientists I hung out with said, yeah, this is all okay. Well, in a way, this was now it should have been a marketer's dream. I published the book just as the UN's Year of the Dolphin is being announced. I'm invited to speak at the New England Aquarium, the Aquarium of the Pacific down in Long Beach. I'm scheduled to do a presentation at an Animal Rights Conference in Oxford, then get another gig speaking in another place in the UK, and I speak at the UN Environmental Program headquarters in Bonn, Connecticut, because they're having the Year of the Dolphin, which then leads them to ask me to be the US ambassador to the Year of the Dolphin program. All of which would sound to me, oh, this book is just going to take off. Well, the book came out in 2007, and I can tell you that most of you probably haven't heard of it. Most of you probably haven't heard of me. And the book has sold still fewer than 2,000 copies, which means not even all the libraries bought it. But the issue is not, book sales. The issue is what this has taught me about trying to communicate back into a mainstream when you do kind of non-traditional work. Because by every mechanism or every measure that you take, the discussion about the book that I was able to get going should have gone somewhere, but it didn't. And this is, as I said, part of one of the main things I'm talking about is the challenges that come from doing multidisciplinary, non-traditional research when the intellectual infrastructure that we have built is really, is really disciplinary. And which is one of the reasons I'm thrilled to be here, because this is in fact only the fourth, in the 20 years or so I've been doing this, only the fourth time I've had, the attention of a group of scientists. In the early 90s, I was living in New Jersey, and I was living in Princeton actually, and I got asked to speak about my work to a group of scientists, although they were mainly physicists and not biologists. A couple of ACS meetings ago, I did a poster. Earlier this year, this is one of the few exceptions to the fact that most of what I've been doing has been largely overlooked. Last year, did a talk at the AAAS meeting. There was a panel, Diana Reese, Laurie Marino, and I, and Jerry Schubel commented on the ethical implications of the scientific research on dolphin intelligence. And so the general, as I said, that's a real exception. And one of the issues that I've been facing, and one of the challenges I think that all of us in the world of marine mammal studies face, is how do you then get engagement on some issues like this? One of the things that engagement of these kinds of issues, at least in my experience so far, has relied on too much is sort of individuals who are really making a fuss about something. When I mentioned the AAAS meeting as an exception, where, so let me talk a little bit about that, because that was very interesting and sort of speaks to this in a different way. That's how do we get not only scientists, but how do we get the general public engaged in the important implications of really progressive scientific research? A woman at MIT, Stephanie Bird, specializes in research ethics. I met her a few years ago, and she was very interested in this whole topic, and asked if, since she puts panels together for the AAAS occasionally, she asked if I'd help her do this. So we lined up Diana and Laurie and Jerry for a panel on all of this. Stephanie proposed it to the AAAS meeting a couple of years ago in Chicago, and they said flatly no. And things would have died there, except Stephanie was very persistent and savvy, believed this was a good topic, that the scientific community should look at it. She pushed, and so she got it into the meeting last year in San Diego. But it was only because of her persistence that this happened. Now, when the abstracts got posted, it caught the attention of the science editor of the London Sunday Times, who wrote a big story about what was coming up. Curiously, it's written as, so scientists announce these discoveries, dolphins as non-human persons. Well, actually, Diana and Laurie and I are talking about things we've done for like 20 years, so it wasn't exactly a discovery, but caught a lot of attention in the press, largely outside of the U.S. I was interviewed by, or contacted by reporters, journalists from South Africa, Hungary, Romania, the UK, Canada, Australia. The BBC sent a film team. Australia sent someone, and I think I was interviewed by the Pacifica station in San Francisco. And it said something also, I think, about the culture in the U.S. and the lack of responsiveness to what were really very significant, scientific issues that people like Laurie and Diana, especially in my background, were bringing up. And so, mainly what I wanted to bring up tonight was a problem. I don't know how to crack this one, although clearly the fact that we're all talking about this and that I got invited is a very positive sign. But the fact that I've been doing this kind of work for 20 years, and I suspect most of you, didn't know that, is, I think, a sign of one of the challenges that we all who are firmly committed to interdisciplinary work have to figure out. And I was serious when I said, if you're a student or you're junior faculty, you don't want to do this kind of thing early in your career because it is risky. And it shouldn't have to. But I've gotten very pragmatic about this kind of thing over the years. So I think the bottom line, as I see this, is that from my side, I continue to try to get philosophers, that is, in appreciating what's involved in interdisciplinary work, I try to get philosophers more appreciative of the fact that the level of sophistication of scientific literature has to go up for anyone who's talking about the rights of non-humans. And I think philosophers have to get out in the field. So please, if a philosopher comes up to you and says, "Can I go and watch your stuff?" Please say yes, and I'm sure you will, because the scientists have been terrific on all of this. And I think that the scientific community, I think, has to be really continue to make an effort. And people like Hal Whitehead, Laurie are very strong on this. Make an effort at looking at the ethical implications, in particular, of the discoveries that science continues to now uncover about cetaceans. Bernardo referred to the Declaration of the Rights of Cetaceans, which, if any of you were at the ACS meeting, you heard Hal talk about. Hal is eloquent on culture in whales, and I'd certainly encourage you to take a look at that website, which is www.cetaceanrights.org, if you haven't. Because I think this is something that is a real challenge for all of us, because unlike where the science was 20 or 30 years ago, when you look at what marine science has revealed about what kind of intellectual and emotional abilities cetaceans have, it really does lead to the necessity for a kind of quiet, calm, serious examination of a variety of things, everything from deaths and injuries to captivity to captive breeding, and the like. Now, unfortunately, in America, there's this penchant for drama, and so the only time issues get discussed are like when there's a tragedy, and it's not really the kind of forum for quiet consideration. But I think from a scientific standpoint, that's one of the things that we need to find a place for. That kind of quiet, serious consideration among scientists, philosophers, ethicists, whomever, to look and see, and managers of for-profit organizations, corporations. Obviously, I come at this from a certain perspective because I teach in a business school, but that also has to be in the mix. So, in this way, I'm just sort of trying to set a problem that I would like us all to think about, because I see my work as kind of an object lesson. It isn't that I did it. Anyone who had done what I did would be in the same situation. But I think that I wanted to talk about this because I think it does present us with a problem that we really all want to find a way around. And I want to end with, I already mentioned about the Declaration. I would encourage people to take a look at that. I want to end with something that has nothing to do with anything that I've been saying directly. But philosophers, as you know, get really, if you don't, your life has been blessed. Philosophers get really picky about language. I mean, I've never known another group of people who can't be pickier about language than philosophers. Most of the time, it's annoying. In this way, though, I think there's something beneficial to it. I would ask you, and I ask you in the spirit of scientific and linguistic precision, to try not to use the word animal as much as you do when you refer to whales and dolphins and porpoises and other marine mammals. Because in common parlance, I'm not giving anyone a hard time, because I understand how this works in the profession. But in common parlance, of course, there's humans and there's animals. And animals always end up, kind of a second tier down. And certainly when the public hear you talk about whales and dolphins, and it's always the animals this, the animals that, it is reinforcing the fact that the notion that you know to be absolutely false, that humans are in every conceivable way unique over all other beings. And so, for example, if my and to be sensitive of the message that conveys, because, for example, as I'm driving home, I'll call my wife, and she says, "Well, how was the day?" And I say, "Well, at midday foraging, I met this really interesting group of animals. There were two adult males, an adult female whom I had some primary social engagement with, and then there were two adult males and an adult female that I had secondary interaction with, and we had normal, some social ritual, informal interaction. It's a much doubler way than saying, I had a really interesting time, meeting Lindsay and Mark and Madeline, and we exchanged business cards and swapped stories." You have to appreciate the fact that when people who are not as sensitive as you are to the continuity of all things in the world of nature, that when they hear you say animal, it reinforces attitudes you don't want to be reinforcing. So I would ask you on occasion to try that instead of saying animal, say dolphin, or say whale, or say porpoise, and just see what it feels like. And again, I want to thank you very much for this opportunity. For me, this has been a huge treat and a huge honor. And I'd like to thank the Civic Life Foundation, the company, and all the people who invited me. And thank you very much.
I'm just interested in, and I'm sorry for not having read your book.
No, most people have it. If you had all read it, I would have blown one of the lines of the story, which is that most of you don't know. And so that's thank you for confirming the fact that most people don't know. I would have been disappointed if you said, "Gee, I don't know what you're talking about. I read the book." So no, I'm serious about this.
But I am interested. So in the, you're saying semantics are very important. So
right.
I'm very interested in this term, non-human persons. If you could just define that a little bit more.
Okay.
That has very specific meaning, obviously, for
right.
me. And I'm not sure I know what that is.
Okay. The short version of this, the long version, you have to buy the book. Actually, you don't even need to buy the book. Go to my website, www.indefenseofdolphins.com. I've got chapter summaries. Despite the fact that I'm teaching in business school, I'm not really a good entrepreneur. So I think I give away all this stuff. Personhood, as I said, is a concept that philosophers use to try to squeeze out biological prejudices, to make investigations sort of less dependent upon species bias. And so there are a variety of definitions. The one I took was what I thought was the most strict, which was a set of criteria that sort of start with being alive, having awareness of, sort of any kind of awareness of the outside world, the ability to perceive pain and pleasure, emotional pain and physical pain and pleasure as well. And as you go up the ladder, things get more sophisticated. The ability to control one's behavior, the ability to recognize other persons, the ability to solve problems with complex information, communicate, to engage in abstract thought, a variety of sophisticated cognitive operations. And the ability, one of the most important, the ability to be self-aware. So I think I may be leaving one out, but it's that combination of traits that most of us would say separate a who from a what. And historically, humans have always said we're the only folk on the planet who have that combination of traits. Now, as most of you probably know, there are people who claim, there are scientists who claim that chimps, orangutans, gorillas, elephants have many or all of those traits as well. So I would say that, well, I would argue that dolphins are non-human persons. I suspect that there's a body of evidence that would suggest the same for many others. Now, I remember when I was talking to Susan Shane early on about this, she said, one of the strange things about the way most humans think about the world of nature is that they don't recognize the continuity that's there. So I can remember when I was asking her about this, she said that she would be surprised when they're not kind of a continuity of this sort of thing. So now the non-human person argument is neither the best nor I think the most accurate argument to go with. It gets more complicated, but I chose that really from a strategic standpoint because in all the talks I've done with the general audience, that's the one that a general audience of skeptics will most likely listen to. So it's got a kind of bias still in there, which I'm not comfortable with, and so actually the next generation of work that I'm doing is kind of trying to move out of that. But that's a long, short answer for what does it mean to be a non-human person. Yes?
I like your acknowledgement that there's probably a continuum here, and there's you spoke of a ladder earlier of traits. I think that the problem that most cetacean biologists have is that within the continuum of cetaceans, there's a huge variation that goes on there, and I think that many of us think that the cognitive abilities of, say, baleen whales may not exceed that of a cow, or at least a wild cow, some wild predecessor of the cow before all intelligence was bred out of it. But certainly, I think most of us would think that wolves would fall within that continuum that's all within cetaceans, and so there are probably other examples as well. You mentioned the great apes and elephants. So how do you deal with personhood on that continuum?
Right, it's a great question because even, you just talked about dolphins. You got, 32 different species. While so much of the research on cognition has been done on bottlenose, I remember Baron Wurtzig saying, man, the smartest of the dolphins. So I'm sure that there are significant differences within that make this kind of an approach problematic. This is one of the reasons I, for myself, have some difficulty with it. The perspective that I'm more comfortable with, but that gets trickier, is that it's not ground, the issue of what counts as ethical treatment of another being is ground less in have they crossed the threshold that we set up, which always has some kind of arbitrariness essentially, potentially built into it. But what are the conditions that are necessary for a being of that nature to engage to develop a kind of full sense of flourishing or development or maturation emotionally and physically? And that then lets you get much more specific about the capacities of each of those different groups you're talking about. And now for that, though, the most important thing, at least from a philosophical standpoint, is one very important threshold is self-awareness, because that does allow for the ability not only to experience pain, but to reflect on it in a way, and to develop a sense of individuality, which does seem to be different between us and, for example, the two cats that my wife has, who are just remarkable beings in their own right, but I just don't, while they have personalities, there's not a kind of inner sense there. That's where it gets long and cumbersome, which I don't want to be here. But thanks for asking, because that's exactly what one of the big problems is, and which is why I pitched in the book, I pitched it to non-human persons, because it's easier for most people to, that's hard enough for most people to suffer. So. Yes, sir.
you bring the issues of cultural transmission into this, because a lot of the time we attach a great deal to cultural transmission because we say that the existence of some sort of quote-unquote culture is very important in the first place, and the ability for it to propagate is an important thing. Has that been included in your definition?
It will be the next time I go at all of this, because when I first did this, I was really trying to limit the perspective, and at the time I didn't pay that much attention to the work that was being done on culture. Specifically, since I've run into Hal Whitehead and I'm now much more familiar with the kind of research being done on that, I see that as a much more critical factor than I had originally seen it. Now, essentially the book was done, and I think I finished that like in 2005, so since then I've been much more sensitive to that. I was hoping actually that Blackwell was going to give me a chance to revise even this. They toyed with the idea, but the sales weren't enough to justify it. But that I've since become persuaded that culture is really significant, in this kind of thing, as a kind of marker, and also not just culture. What's the deal with what's being passed down? So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Okay, thank you very much, and.